Welcome, everybody. We are delighted to welcome you to this evening's event. My name is Olivia Carpenter, and I'm a university lecturer at the University of York. I teach in the English department, where I teach classes on Black studies and 18th century literature. A few technical notes before I introduce our speakers. Subtitles are available for this event. To turn these on or off, please use the CC Show Captions button down at the bottom of your screen. Should you have any technical issues such as loss of Wi-Fi, you can rejoin the event using the original link, and that will take you back here. If you are watching live, you can ask questions using the Q&A button on your screen, and this is available throughout the event. So questions can be posted at any time, and towards the end, we will ask some of your questions to our wonderful panelists. Please also remember that today's event is being recorded, so you will be able to watch again. And now, without further ado, I have the honor of introducing our speakers. First, I will introduce Gretchen Gerzina, who is the Paul Murray Kendall Chair in Biography and Professor of English at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Previously a tenured professor at Vassar College and Barnard College, Columbia University. She was also the Kathy Tapp Vernon Professor of Biography at Dartmouth, where she was the first Black woman to chair an Ivy League English department. In addition, she was the Eastman Professor at Oxford University at Balliol, a professor at Brunel University, and has directed 3 academic programs in African American studies. She has written several acclaimed books, including Carrington, Francis Hodgson Burnett, Mr. and Mrs. Prince, and she was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Antiquarian Society, and appears often on radio and podcasts in Britain and in the United States. And we are also very honored to be joined by Paterson Joseph tonight. Paterson Joseph is a British actor and writer who's recently seen on Visual and Noughts and Crosses, and he's also appeared in Peep Show and Law and Order and played Arthur Slugworth in the recent Wonka movie. He is the author of The Secret Diaries of Charles Ignatius Sancho, which reimagines the life and times of the maverick Black writer and composer in 18th century London. And in 2023, he was installed as Chancellor of Oxford Brookes University. And today they'll be discussing the fascinating stories of Black England in the 18th century. I'm so excited and happy to get to talk with both of them this evening. And I wanted to kind of kick us off by asking you both a little bit about where these incredible journeys began. Both of these books must have been years in the making. The painstaking research that must have gone into both of these things must have been such an epic journey. Where did you get started? Wherever do you begin with something this big?
Well, I guess I can start, but Paterson has a better story, I'm sure. But I started because I was living in London, and this is a story I've told several times. I was living in London, and the wonderful book Staying Power had come out, and I wanted to find it in paperback because it was too heavy for me to haul around in hardcover. And I went into a very well-known bookshop, and I asked if they had this book. And the woman just sort of pulled herself up and looked at me and said, "Madam, there were no Black people in Britain before the 1940s. She said 1945, which was even stranger. And I said, "Oh, yes, there were." And she said, "Not in any numbers." And she never even looked for the book, which turned out, of course, was on a shelf someplace, but I bought it at another shop. And I left thinking, I need to write a book so that people can't say that anymore. Lots of people, scholars and historians, had written about the Black history in Britain, but I wanted a book that would just appeal to a wider audience and say, and it's really important. And I hate to think that people will always think that the Windrush brought the first Black people to Britain. So that's how it started for me. And I don't think I've ever looked back.
I suppose for me, it's well, Gretchen said it would be a better story, but it's just a more chaotic one because, of course, my job is acting. That's been my day job for over 35 years. So I was a dabbler in writing, and I had always written stories that were about my family, perhaps my parents who came from St. Lucia, which was a British colony, Caribbean island, British colony until 1979. So when they came, they were British citizens. And I think about those days and how tough it was when they got to England, the hostility, the fact that they thought it was the mother country, which is what all the people of the colonies were told, the children of empire. And they came to realize when they got here that that was not the case at all, that they were strangers here. So that story of conflict, which of course my generation had a slightly different take to, since we were born here or grew up here, always fascinated me. That they stayed, that they were being pushed away, that they were told that they weren't welcome, all of those awful things, they still stayed. And so I was always fascinated by them as a generation. They're extraordinary in terms of their confidence in themselves, who they were, these Caribbean people, or West Indians as they became when they left their islands. And that's the story I was writing about whenever I had time to write, whenever I had a moment away from a film set or a theatre show. And then in 1999, after I had been writing a few things and sort of hiding them away in drawers because I wasn't very confident, I discovered this incredible book. My first thing was really, I've been doing lots of, costume dramas, I suppose you'd call them, but really classical European plays in all these theatres everywhere. But it was always the idea that you were sort of being elbowed in, that you weren't really there in the 19th century or 18th century or 15th century or wherever this thing was set. But we put you in because you're a decent actor. And I did feel like it's sort of privileged that I was able to play these roles despite the fact that I wasn't there. So then I got curious and I thought, what if I found a character before 1948 and the famous Windrush generation? To briefly explain, the Windrush was a transport ship, a converted transport ship that took Caribbean migrants from the West Indies to Britain to help after the post-war sort of devastation, to help build the roads, the transport system, to drive buses, etc., etc. And the boat landed in probably Montego Bay. Certainly a lot of the Caribbean people would gather there or gather in Antigua, and off the boat went to England. So to me, it was fascinating, but it was also, it felt like the beginnings of things. And then I thought, well, if I could find a story, and here I find this book called Black England by an author you might have heard of. And, Gretchen's book was so, to be honest with you, when I first started reading it, and it talked about Septimius Severus, who was the emperor of the Roman Empire in the 2nd century AD, and he came to Britain to rebuild Hadrian's Wall and to defeat the tribes north of the wall. I thought, is this made up? So I looked at the back to see if it was a legitimate publication published by a legitimate press, or whether it was one of those people who, have a bad photocopy of Beethoven and say he was clearly black. I was a cynic, put it that way. But going through this book, and of course there's now a new version, a new shiny version with Zadie Smith, one of our great Black British writers, adding a preface which basically says the same thing as me, which is that this is my first introduction to Black British history, despite the fact that I was already in my 30s when I discovered this book. And in it is a black and white print of this man, Charles Ignatius Sancho, and that was my beginning. As soon as I saw this, and it was in black and white in that particular edition, as soon as I saw this, I was like, that is extraordinary. Who is that? How is that? How could he be, given where he was born? And that was the beginning of my journey back in 1999. And here I am, still doing it.
Isn't that quite amazing, though, that we both started off a long time ago and still at it?
Yes, and I suppose if you'd asked me, certainly, if you'd still be doing, would I still be doing this in 25 years' time? I'd be saying, no, I surely would have moved on and been, writing something else or thinking about something else. But I suppose this is a good place to start. Sancho is a good place to start because he goes all the way through the 18th century. pretty much. Certainly the seminal bits. A few years after we had become a United Kingdom, all the way until the beginnings, in my opinion, of the proper, anti-slavery movement in sort of 1780s. So he's a good person to start. So I ended up going down this cul-de-sac with Sancho. So rather than it just being the slightly vain thing of, oh, I found a character I can play, and I maybe can get an Olivier or a BAFTA for putting on a big, fat suit because he was overweight and having a good voice and all the rest of it. But it became more about identity. To put, not to hedge anything, it's about my identity as a Black Briton. That's what it became.
I think it's really important that you say that, because I'm now working on my 4th book about Black Britain, and I'm an American, and I have lived in England on and off, many times, and for years at a time, each time. And yet there's a piece of me that feels like, who am I to be telling these stories? I did not grow up with this. This is not my country. But in a way, it reminded me so much of what we didn't know, even in America, about African-American history. And even now, when I give talks, people are so puzzled by the kinds of things I tell them, and remind them that these things are true, that these things happen. And the same thing still happens in England a bit, that, do you get that disbelief that,
I mean, to be honest with you, I'm surprised that you get it as much as you do, because I have always considered, and I think we mostly do, that America is more enlightened about its own history. Possibly because it's more containable, because it's shorter, but I do think that we presume you're all aware. So my shock when I went to America to do the show, and I hadn't really performed it here very much in England, was the question that I got at the end of the show, which is probably why I modified it in the new play to bring a bit of my own self into it and explain who Sancho is before we go into it. The question I would get most in the Q&As, or what do you call it, brown bag meetings, which I was funny, brown bag, it was, did Britain ever have slavery? And I hear when I do, when I do my show based on the book with American audience, with British audiences, that they sort of laugh at that. But I hold them up and I say, well, how could they possibly know anything else? If our history doesn't teach us about our own Black British history, how could they possibly know more in America about that? Our history has taught us that we had a bit of slavery, we're quite ashamed of it, but then there was Wilberforce and the Quakers and the Quaker women, and we resisted, and then we lost 2,000 sailors during our blockade of the French and nasty Spanish and Dutch people who were bringing captive Africans across. This heroic story is really our blueprint for the history of Britain and slavery, and it isn't deep, and it isn't very, accurate, and so no wonder the Americans struggle with it. So yes, absolutely, Gretchen, it is the same here. I'm met with blank looks when I talk about John Blank. John Blank, who's the trumpeter for Henry VIII, extraordinary person, not just because he was clearly a skilled musician, but because of his exalted position in the courts of the Tudor kings and queens. And when I talk about that, I see the audience, and I talk to them afterwards, of course. They are absolutely blown away and angry that they don't know this history. They feel frustrated that they were told a history that is not full. And that's the UK, and clearly, of course, America as well, when it comes to our own history. But certainly when I think about the 1619 project, it's been a shock for America too, generally, to learn the deeper, longer history of African captives on that continent.
It is I think it's because America had massive slavery on its own land.
Yes.
But that most Americans don't realize the extent to which enslaved people populated South America, the Caribbean. They really just think it happened here and nowhere else. And I definitely feel that the work we do is to inform and enlighten and to make up for those things that they weren't taught, not to berate people or chastise them because it's not their fault that they did not learn these things, but to make it accessible and to make it exciting and to say, this is a real story. It's not fiction. It's not fiction.
That's right. And it's also important, I think, to let people know that they are in, when I say people, I'm actually probably talking about white people, to be honest with you, because Black people, either they know this history already or are curious, instantly curious, and know that it's important for them to know it. I think for white people, it's really important that they know that this history isn't about, as you say, berating or chastising their ancestors or themselves for their complacency or ignorance. It's about understanding your national story, because it's a major component of your national story and it is not taught. Therefore, you yourself as a white Briton have a very narrow view of your history. And again, it's not political. This is simply, we're a nation and we don't know what all of these people were doing and how important they were to us as a nation. And that's wrong in and of itself. And I think I'm certain that guilt and shame played a major part in Britain suppressing that kind of information. It wasn't done by committee. I don't think it was done systematically. I think it was, as Gretchen and I look through archives and we see things that interest us and we have not making stuff up and we're bringing it forward. Well, there were thousands of people before us who've been looking at these archives. What didn't they see? Or what did they see that they didn't really want to explore? And part of it, I think, is a kind of shame about that history. But without that history being told, what I say in my show and what I pretty much say everywhere I go, we don't really know ourselves. And that would be true in America as well as in Britain. We don't know our full picture. Like a family only knows the story of, the mother and doesn't know the story of any of the daughters or their father. It's a picture, but it's not a full picture. And that's, to me, the exciting thing as well about this history is that you're bringing people into a wider understanding even of their own country's story.
Can I ask? I'm so curious about this for both of your books, because you had to think, or we are thinking about this incredibly complicated response from audiences based on what they know or don't know or how they feel about it. Did you think about that as you were creating this? Or is it really necessary in order to create kind of good art and good writing, as you both did? Did you have to press pause on that? Did you have to kind of tune out what you think the audience is going to think in order to be able to write it all?
Wow. Well, Gretchen, you're ahead of me on this. Can you tell us what your thoughts are on it?
I remember when the book first published, the first edition, not the new one, I was doing a lot of interviews and, book talks and things in London. And I did one for a show, a radio program, where the host told me, he was Black British. He told me that his nephew had seen the book on his shelf because he was preparing to do the interview. And he took it and ran with it. And he said, "We were here. I didn't know we were here." So there was a kind of mixed feeling I had of people who had been there, whose families may have been there for centuries. I'm sure in Liverpool, people have been there for centuries, Bristol, London, but had no idea. And he said the joy on his nephew's face was quite amazing. So I always thought that on the one hand, it was to say, yes, you were here, but it was also to tell people who didn't think you were here that you were here.
Yes. I mean, there's definitely a byproduct of, told you so. Because honestly, I grew up in a place where there weren't a lot of scholars or teachers, etc. around me, certainly not of history. So I didn't really grow up with that knowledge. But I do know that there were rumors that there were Black people in England before the Second World War. And those rumors are always either met with, yeah, that's right, they've been telling us lies, and it ended there. Or it was, well, that person doesn't seem to be in control of themselves. You know, they're on the high street shouting, or it was always a sort of in slightly odd situation. It was never in a school, it was never on television, it was never in a, so to actually find this information and be able to convey it to people is really powerful, because what this man's nephew experienced, I experienced. So as a Briton who grew up in not too far from where I am now, Northwest London, I had to witness brick walls painted, and this is a trigger warning, but here it is, it's the truth, blacks out, or it would say wogs out, and N-word, go home. And the big one that I remember really well was keep Britain white. So, you know, you're walking around the place you live, the only place you were born, the only language you spoke. This is your country as far as you know. Certainly you have no experience of anywhere else, never been to anywhere else. And you're finding this hostility, and you're getting it in school. And we did get it in school as well, which we can talk about. We did get it, obviously, on the street, random people shouting things, attitudes, you know, with in education, attitudes in the workplace. And I'm imbibing all of this to actually be able to go, they were wrong. They were wrong because they were ignorant, because they weren't taught that there's a long, long history, obviously at least 2,000 years old, of African people being on British soil and interacting and living and working and loving and having families. And it's a revolution within the person to think that people who look like you, even though you have been pushed away and vilified simply by the color of your skin, were here and did contribute, majorly contributed to British history. It's a big deal.
I saw, and I'm, you know, as an American, we had a different thing, you know, dogs, fire hoses, all of that sort of thing. My Black ancestors were on a plantation, enslaved on a plantation in North Carolina. So this all becomes very real. But I remember when I was the first time I had lived in England, I wasn't in London at the time. I remember just going, I won't tell you what town it was, but there was a big sign, you know, and commemorating a boy who'd raised so much money for the war effort, along with his dog, N-word. And then I went round the corner and I saw an entire toy shop filled from to the top with gollywogs. And then I was at a dinner in America with some British friends, and I said, well, you know, that is not a word you can use here. And they said, oh, but it's never been a bad word in England. You're misunderstanding. And as though I had somehow taken offense, I was woke, you know, because the word was used commonly. So therefore it must be benign. And it's not benign. But I think that's what that drew me to the 18th century, which was before now the kind of heyday of the Black population growth and moving around and being visible in art and in writing and in novels. There were over 200 novels that contain a Black character in the 18th century. Some of them are just walking through and you barely notice them,
Wow.
but they're there, 200 of them. So
that's
everybody,
amazing. I've never heard that before. That's extraordinary.
It's true. I have a list, but I don't share it. But because most of them are very bad indeed, but that's okay. And it got to be so that people were so used to seeing Black people, and novelists, you know, like the woman who was a widow and had to make her living by her pen, and she knew she had to put a Black person in it just because that's what people did. And there they do, they kind of walk through, or they're in the background. And it became so much when I started researching the book that I put it in the introduction, I think, the first time, was that it was like double vision. I'd be walking down a road in London, and a Black person a child might be passing me, and I immediately would see next to that child an 18th century Black page with a turban carrying his lady's lapdog on a cushion or something like that as they went to the theater. And everyone, even now, when I see a busker on the street in London, I also immediately go back to the people we know who were, busking on the streets in the 18th century. So it's really a sense of double vision. It never leaves me, when I'm there. I just see these parallel lines. And it breaks my heart that what you said about not being taught it and not believing it, because in America, certain states have now passed laws that you cannot teach anything that will hurt somebody's feelings. And the idea is that if you were a white child and you learned that there was slave plantations down the street from you, the next town over, then you will feel guilty and you will feel bad. And therefore, we will not teach you that. So we may be coming up to a generation that is even less knowledgeable than what you encountered when you were growing up.
Yeah, that's very frightening. And we have similar resistance here to teaching Black British history, as if it's a separate history to British history.
Yeah.
We have only one course, which is a master's in Black British literature. One course in the whole of the United Kingdom. And it's at Goldsmiths. And it was under threat. And thankfully, it's been, to a certain extent, saved for another couple of years.
I didn't know that. That's good. I'm glad it was saved.
Yeah, but it is extraordinary that we're having to fight for the one Black British literature course. So actually, the ignorance is quite deep here. So we're in that situation. We don't need anti-critical race theory, as they might call it in the US, because we have it naturally. We have it as a matter of course. This is British history, which is white history, and then there's other history. And the other history always has to take second place. But actually, what we should talk about is the fact that the 18th century is seminal to the growth of the British Empire as empire. It didn't necessarily think of itself as an empire before this century and into the 19th. It wasn't even a union until the beginning of the century. 1707 was the first active union. It was at war with Scotland halfway through that century. It lost America in that century. It gained major footholds in India in that. This is a century that turned us from, William Dalrymple is a wonderful historian. Highly recommend his podcast with Anita Anand, Empire. It's wonderful. That Britain was a third world country, like a third division country in football terms. We weren't great. And then slavery happened, and talking about, 17th century onwards. And we become this superpower. Well, slavery was a major part of that. Black people were a major part of that. If we don't know that bit, we only know a bit of our story, to reiterate my own sort of mantra. And I think that's our issue. Our issue is that we think we know our history. And here are these people, these Americans, like Gretchen Gerzina, coming in and trying to tell us well, she's telling us stuff that's there, available, but the historians who'd come before had not felt was interesting. The wonderful thing about the fact that there are 200 characters in the 18th century novels, and yet, apart from, I remember Tom Jones, there is a footman character in Tom Jones that piqued my interest, but I've read loads of those novels, and it's just passed me by. Why? Because it wasn't considered to be an important enough demographic to tell stories about. They were there because they were there, like you say, well, we're a horsey country, so everybody's got a horse. Everybody had a horse, so you mentioned the horse. Or everybody had a little lapdog, so you mentioned the lapdog. It isn't necessarily humanizing that person. We don't really hear from them. We don't know what they thought about anything, yet they're just there. But that to me is already fascinating. The fact that you have to paint the picture of your world, and regardless of whether they respected that person or not as a human being, they had to put them in. That to me is fascinating. And I think we're in that place where we're talking about taking a sketch of history. Britain had slavery, and then they take that first bit before the Wilberforce, etc., and try to understand it. And the 18th century is a good place for that, because so much was decided, so much was portioned out in terms of the Caribbean in particular, and America eventually. So yeah, it's to me the most important thing is that when we talk about these things, is that it isn't just about proving us right or accusing. It's about, we'll keep probably coming back to it because I think it's the most important thing, painting the fuller picture of the 18th century and including those people who were never included. And that just that doesn't just go for Black people. There's a lot of people who weren't included in that history. You think about people, you know, you think about women, you think about you know, the stories of immigrants from other nations. You think about third gender people. You think about what was really happening, and we don't know that story because the stories were told by one demographic. They were all male, pretty much, all middle class, and all white. So this is so vital that we, as a sort of modern Black writers, talk about this, because those voices weren't heard then. And I suppose in a way what we're doing is articulating voices that were silenced. And to think about bringing those people to life, obviously that's majorly what I want to do, is to make people think they can see these people walking and talking. They're not just you know, figures on a canvas or in a book. I want you to, both of us want you to meet these people as they lived, and as they loved, and as they survived and thrived. And that's important to us. It's not just about slavery, but it's about life and humanity, and how I mean, how deeper a picture you paint of a Black person's life if you say, yes, of course they were a victim of this, but how did they survive it? That for me is the most important thing about this century. And I get why Black people shy away from it too. Oh, it's just about slavery. I don't want to hear about slavery. I've heard enough about slavery. I'd like to talk about pre-colonial Africa. I'd like to talk about the great things we've achieved. That's good, but it's so vital in the story of Britain, the 18th century, and it's so vital in the story of how Black people negotiated being here too.
When may I just ask you a question? First of all, I wanted to congratulate you. Your novel is just wonderful, and you won an award from the Royal Academy for Literature, and I know we had that wonderful article that we all read about you in The Guardian, and I read all the comments, and they all were about Peep Show, and I kept saying, he wrote this wonderful novel. You need to go out and read this book and talk about it, because what you did, you know, I saw it writ large. I told lots of individual stories. I wanted to make, and some nice stories, not just horror stories. And you take the same amount of research and focus in and represent that whole period with one person and all the people he knew, and you bring it alive on the stage, and so you use a fictional mode to tell a true story.
Yes.
So I just think it's remarkable that we can branch out, write about the same kind of things, approaching it from different directions, and still both trying to make it come alive and be real.
Yes,
and I'm assuming.
What are you assuming?
No, I'm assuming that one day this is going to be on the screen.
Well, I mean, obviously I would always hope that to be the case. I mean, I'd rather it be in schools first, then on screen. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I have to say, Mr. and Mrs. Prince was, it was inspiring because I know the level of your scholarship, Gretchen, and I know the depth with which you research, but also that you don't write anything that you can't back up. Whereas the work that I'm doing, and I suppose people who write historical fiction in particular have to do, is balance what could be considered the dry facts, although I think facts are fascinating, but the dry fact, and trying to make that into a story of some kind. There is a bit of fabulation going on. There's a bit of sort of creating, but actually what Mr. and Mrs. Prince does, your book, is it does both to me. It both informs and tells me a story. There's elements of it that feel like a thriller almost. Will they, won't they, can they make it? Will they make it? How are they going to get through? The fact that they are exceptional, extraordinary people, and yet you bring domesticity to them is very powerful. I wouldn't ever underestimate that. It's quite a difficult thing to do. Shakespeare's a good example, I suppose. Yeah, because he'll take somebody like Julius Caesar, who is an icon, and we know all about him, and then he'll have him having this domestic insomnia night where his wife tells him he shouldn't go to work because she's been having dreams, and he goes, yes, I mustn't. And then somebody else goes, oh, you're going to listen to your wife, and he goes, no, of course I'm not. No, I'm going to go. There's something beautifully domestic about the way Shakespeare takes big characters and tells you what's going on in them, what could possibly be going on in their minds, you know. And that's what you did with Mr. and Mrs. Prince. And it made me think there's a way of doing both history and novel and keeping the integrity of the history whilst, you know, sort of entertaining people with a story. So, you know, props to you and thank you for your inspiration.
Well, Black England was the book that has stayed with me longest, decades and decades, and then revising it and updating and rewriting it. Mr. and Mrs. Prince was a book I wrote about an 18th century formerly enslaved couple. Before they met, well, they were both enslaved. He was much older than she was, and it was in New England, in Vermont and Massachusetts. And I wanted to tell this story because everybody had, there's falsehoods all over the internet and all of that. My ancestors freed these people. No, they did not. And it took 7 years, and my husband joined me on this journey. And the moment I didn't know how to tell this story of these two people, and the moment I said, it's about trying to find them, it was about the quest. And the quest started like, how do I find these people? Where do I go? And two things happened besides my husband joining me, which was a godsend because I had to go back to work. The first was that I discovered that the man of the couple that I was writing about was actually owned by my white ancestral family. And people said, you're descended from a slave. And I said, no, my ancestors owned this man. And I wanted to show how he engineered his own freedom. So that was the first thing I said, oh my goodness, I can tell this story and I'm implicated somehow, as though they waited for me to tell it. And I actually went to their property, which is a stone cellar hole. And I sat there to commune with them. And one day I saw them. I know this sounds so odd, but they walked out and they said, tell our story. And then I found out this thing, and that's what made the book for me come alive, like these people. But Black England was a whole different thing. I thought, oh, the nerve of me going to write about all this. So
yes,
it's just wonderful to hear that you did it.
You say this, Gretchen, but I honestly, thank God that you met the spirits or the ghosts of
whatever they were.
This is it's an interesting area actually to talk about because well,
it's Shakespearean, right?
Yeah, exactly. But I do feel possessed by this man. So yes. I kind of get it. But just to sort of talk about that thing, Gretchen, of thank God for you, because I don't know if I suppose I could have waited for the wonderful. There are other books, of course, The Staying Power. There's all sorts of books. But I would have had to wait a very long time for this, which is the brilliant David Ocean, Black and Britons, and I would have been gutted that I didn't know it earlier. The thing about it is, it's not just oh, you're an American, you shouldn't be. It's how you write it, and I know I've talked about this, and I'll just say again, you can write history that goes in one ear out the other. You can, and I've read books like that where you properly making notes because you know you won't remember that. You write story as well, which I'm so interested in, because I do, and I say it in the play, and I say it all the time, that's the way we remember anything. And isn't that what we're trying to do, I suppose, Gretchen, in a way? Is we're trying to get people to, and I know they don't know, but it's a kind of remembrance. Well, I call that first play, Sancho, an act of remembrance. It's like, I am asking you, we're asking you to, when you look back at the 18th century, to see it in its full technicolor, to see everybody who is in there, not just the heroes, usually male, the odd heroine. And that's what you do with your work. So I don't know that there is another writer who could have done it. There's something unique about being an historian with that grasp of history, understanding what it means as an African-American too, part of your ancestry, what it means to have that history told. And you've come to a field that is kind of empty because people weren't really, at that point, we were living in, we talk about 99 into the noughties and 2010. People were telling me that we were in a post-racist society, that we were in a post-racist world, and that plays like Sancho and about Sancho and slavery were old hat. We didn't need to know it, everybody knew it. So your book was terribly important. It was a proper catalyst, and you should never, I hope you never do again, feel that you are an infiltrator in some way, because it's the foreign observers who've helped me understand Black. No, it really is. When I think about one example, so we think about in the novel, I send Sancho to a tavern on Fleet Street, and I call it the Black Tar Tavern, tar as in sailor. And in it, he he finds these extraordinary people from the transatlantic world who are playing all these instruments. These are sailors from Arabia, from India, from Africa, from all sorts of parts of Africa, from the African Caribbeans and African Americans, some of whom were runaway slaves, some of whom came of their own volition. And here we have this amazing gathering, Fleet Street, there's bar and there's music. And I didn't make that up. I made up the details, but I didn't make that up because it was many foreign correspondents would come and say, well, there are these taverns in the cities, and this is all over England, where Black people frequented. And in fact, the Morning Chronicle, probably, I suppose it might have been a British correspondent in this case, talks about a tavern on Fleet Street, which is frequented by Black men and their ladies, and no whites are allowed to enter this establishment. This is 1761. Ridiculous. Of course, it would have been very much sort of full of everybody. But that's the richness. That's the richness that we're trying to bring. We're trying to turn up that color contrast, show people how the world was. And why shouldn't you, as an observer, be the best person to be able to go, this is what I see, and I don't want you ever to feel anything other than our gratitude that you got interested in our little bit of history.
But I don't want people to think I was the first. I mean, I'm always careful to say I stand on the shoulders of people who did wonderful research for years in this field. I did go back and retrace their steps and go back to all the original files and rethink all of their stories. I was in York Minster, found Granville Sharp's letter book had not been available. They actually digitized all of them for me because nobody had ever seen them. So I knew certain things about him, but we had to go. I had to go there and read them. And then that led me to a place in New York where I actually found the transcript of one of the trials that he had been participating in. And so when people said, oh, well, you're just repeating what everybody else said, I said, you have no idea the depth of research that all of us have to do. And we're probably close to being out of time, but I know Olivia might have a last question for us because I got so intrigued by listening.
Well, I'll ask you one last question, but I will take it from the audience Q&A. We've had a variety of different questions come in and lots of thank yous and lots of fans just saying, we love you. So I will iterate that. The repeat question has come up quite a lot about Black representation now. We're asking about Bridgerton. We're asking about future fiction. We're asking about well, what do we think what are the new stories to tell coming up next? And where do we hope to see more representation? Where do we hope to see more understanding into the future?
Wow.
I have an answer, but I want to hear Paterson's first too.
Okay. Well, let me try and keep mine brief for a change. I work in the world of, so Gretchen's thinking that's not going to happen. I work in the world of performance, and so I think about radio plays, I think about theatre plays, I think about novels, I think about literature in that way. I think obviously about films and television. To me, things like Bridgerton are great in and of themselves. They're good fun, they're rollicking great dramas. My slight problem with it is the did Britain ever have slavery question that I got in America a lot. So if you're an American and you believe that Britain never had slavery, and then you see Bridgerton, it confirms everything that you knew, which is that Black people had it easy in the UK. I don't think that was Shonda Rhimes, the producer's intent. I think what she found was what I had been finding since at least 2010, when I tried to sell a TV version of this world, that there is a major resistance to Black people being in these dramas. So therefore, you have to find a way to elbow them in. And Shonda Rhimes clearly just went to heck with that and just kicked the door down and just made this amazing drama. And I know it's based on a novel, I believe. And to me, there's nothing wrong in and of itself. It's only that we haven't had enough of the other stuff. We haven't had enough of the real for us to then go, oh, this is a fantasy based on what we know to be the case.
That's right.
That they were Indian people, that they were Arab people, that they were African people, that they were Caribbean people working and moving amongst that higher up the echelon is true, is very, very rare, but it happened, that's fine. But the rest of the world, the majority of what was happening is left out of the picture, clearly, because it's not that kind of drama. It's about love and who will love who, and a bit of family manipulation. It's a great drama. It's fantastic. Its problem is its timing for me, that I wish that we'd had a slew of real, rooted, grounded dramas about British life in the 18th century, 19th century, that told the truth, so that that fantasy could be enjoyed even more in some ways, I suppose you might. So that to me is a slight difficulty with it. Without disparaging it or saying don't watch it, I wouldn't say that. I just say people don't really understand the context of it, which can make it a bit problematic.
I totally agree with that. And my take on it is, first of all, I loved the first series. You know, I just thought this is great. And then I started seeing people shoehorning characters in just to make sure that there was a Black person represented in the, so in what was it, Howard's End. I saw, which a book I teach often, Howard's End. They made the maid Black, and then there's a woman who was a prostitute and causes all sorts of troubles, and they made her Black as well. And I think they haven't changed much at all. You know, they put a Black person in there and they made her a prostitute and a servant. So this is just awful. And then I watched something like Sanditon, and I know that, you know, Jane Austen wrote, what, 3 sentences about Miss Lamb, and and what she says is that she is basically 1/4 Black. Yeah. She has a mixed race mother, a mixed heritage mother, and a white father. And she is sent to England. But on the screen, they don't know how to portray that ambiguity of race. So they have to make her dark-skinned in order to say, oh, but she was a Black heiress. Oh, I get it now. So they're changing even some of these things. Now, Bridgerton, which I did enjoy, I stopped watching after a couple of, you know, series, but the one thing I think that Shonda Rhimes does really well is say, okay, we know about slavery. We know there were lots of Black people in the 18th century in London. If you're smart, you know it. Otherwise, you should think about it. And I know that this is a fantasy, but the question I'm asking is, what if?
Yes.
What if those people really could have achieved that level of what if they could have been intermarrying in that way? What would this have looked like? And I can tell you a darn good story at the same time. So that's why I like Bridgerton. But I totally agree with your objections to it, because people do probably think, oh yes, they all had nice Georgian houses and, you know, all of that. Anyway, that was a long answer to a quick question.
That's my fault, because I don't do short answers. Right, fire away, public.
We've got questions about kind of dealing with the complexities and responsibilities that you kind of have to deal with when telling these stories. And I think you've really touched on this in an interesting way, but I wanted to ask a question from Elena asking, how do you, if you're bringing, kind of giving voices to silenced people and trying to make sure that they can sing out today, how do you deal with how hard that can be? How do you deal with what a heavy responsibility that must feel like to accomplish?
Can I very quickly say, I take the same responsibility as I do with characters that I portray. No matter who they are, no matter what bad things they do or is reported that they do by other characters, I have to sit inside their mind and see the world as they see it, not the world as other people see them. Do you see what I mean? So that they're not commenting on themselves. If I was playing, you know, a horrible dictator, you can imagine many of them, I would have to think of myself as being heroic, that what I had in mind was brilliant and a genius idea and would help the whole of humanity, despite the fact that it'd be. So I have to get inside the head and not comment on it. So I did the same with Sancho.
Really?
That even though I know a lot more than he does, I've studied Black British history, he hasn't. He was making it, but he couldn't study it because it was not available. Oh, there goes my light. Oh, it's okay. It's not bad. I'll get it But I needed to keep inside his mind and in his time. So when I looked at situations that I understood the consequences of, I couldn't go ahead and have Sancho be this sort of savant, that he would actually be able to know what was going to happen in the future, or what was right or what was wrong about what was happening in his time, because we very rarely can see out of our own time when we're in it. So that's the most important thing to me, to keep the integrity of the time, to keep the integrity of the knowledge of the person that I'm dealing with. It's slightly different to Gretchen in that I'm fictionalizing it. So I am putting myself in a quite exalted place of I'm moving this character around and making them make decisions. But I was constantly aware of not making him me, not making him a 20th or 21st century person, and to root him in his time. And I suppose that helped me. It gave me boundaries, but it helped me not think, am I betraying him in some way by using him, as a cipher for this, or to comment on this thing that I find, that I want to comment on. And that was the most important thing, to keep my own integrity, to allow him to have his integrity in the time and the knowledge that he would have had. I hope that makes sense.
I live in a world of footnotes, and I'm always aware that I cannot say anything that I cannot prove, because someone will call me on it, and I'll say, no, here is the document, here is the location, you too can go to this archive and read this letter. This is not made up in any way. And in Mr. and Mrs. Prince, I put no footnotes, but they're blind notes, meaning they have no number on the page. Yes. So that all the notes are at the end. So you can look up page 47 in the end notes in the back, and you can see, oh, here was a document, here was a bar tab, here was something that proved it. But I didn't want to interrupt the flow of the story, but they're there in the back for people who can read that far. So I'm always aware that everything I want to say if someone wants to question me, the answer is back there. I have the proof, and I tried to bring people to life from just the little bits. A man named Jack Beef that I just took a shine to in that book. And I'd say, but here are the questions we don't know. We have these letters, but did he have a family? Did he, what was it like when he went back home I think he was from St. Kitts. And what was his life really like when he had to report that somebody stole his wig while he was on horseback, and I had to get over the fact that he wears a wig. My God, he's a slave man in a wig, but to always go inside in the way you're saying it, but to be able to support it, to tell a story, but not to interrupt it by saying, I can prove it. Just say, it's there. You look for it, I can prove it, but I don't have to hit you over the head with it. Same as yours with fiction. You can create scenes. I can't do that.
Well, you do, and you have.
Well, I mean, not in that way. I can't make things up and say, oh, he walked into this dark room and 15 people were sitting at a table. Yeah. Anyway, Olivia, that was a long answer.
No, but the thing is, though, Gretchen, look, if I read David Olusoga's book that I just taught, Miranda Kaufman's book, Black Tudors, another great book. Though she is a very, like you, disciplined historian, the way, as you both do, you tell that bit of history is storytelling in and of itself. I'm engaged because you've given me a little story outline. You've given me beginning, middle, you've given me twists, and you've given me, even in the short stories that sometimes Miranda tells in here, or that you tell in Black England, I'm engaged. Why else would I go off and, have a 25-year career writing about it if I wasn't inspired by the way you had delivered it? Because you see, facts don't stick. I said this right at the beginning. They do not stick. You can give me 100 facts. If I've got the skill to be able to, and I've got that kind of sticky brain, yes, maybe. But you show me a story, you tell me a story, or you put this in story form and give me the opportunity to paint a picture, and I'm gone. I'm gone, and I will remember that. You have changed my mind. No, really, but just
I know
the way one writes. And it's not flim-flam. This is why you're important to me and to Zadie, because we're storytellers. And you can use dry facts, but dry facts don't convey anything except, you know, a sort of itemized bill of somebody's life. It's the conjunctions. It's what led somebody from A to D. It's what happened between B and C that we're interested in, not simply just that happened, this happened, and then they died. And it's negotiating that, as Saidiya Hartman, Professor Saidiya Hartman says, in critical fabulation, she's talking about, as far as I interpret it, taking those threadbare archives. And even if you say, well, I don't know exactly what happened, there are 100 other people or 50 other people, even 20 other people that I have who went through similar things, so I can use some of that. And it's the best thing to convey the story that you take from the, you know, the choices of direction a certain character could go. And that's interesting to do. But of course, in the back of my head, there's always like, ting, 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 make sure it's as historically accurate as you could possibly make it.
Yeah.
I don't like anachronisms. I don't like sort of the Disneyfication, you know, I could say that, of that century, where you can actually then start to do pop references. You know, I feel like there's no place for that. For me, that's a completely different kind of fantasy novel or fantasy work. What I love is the mixture of what you're doing solidly in Black England and what I'm trying to do with Sancho, which is take history and make it colorful, make it come alive in some way, and tell stories, but never ever give up the integrity of the history that you can prove and you can back up.
We are just about at time. What an absolute treat to get to see both of you together at the same time in conversation. Thank you so very much from the bottom of my heart for joining us today. I'm clapping. I imagine the audience is doing the same.
That's so lovely. Well, it's a pleasure to sit with Gretchen and talk. I always learn so much, and can't wait to see. I'll be seeing you soon. I hope.
I hope so. That'd be great. Be great. But I'm glad it gave us another opportunity to talk about some of the work we care the most about in the world.
Yes.
So thank you for giving us the chance to converse.
Thank you, Olivia, and thank you everybody who attended.
Thank you.
All of you.
A reminder that the recording of this event will be available on the festival's York Ideas YouTube channel, which can be accessed from the Watch Again section of the festival. And you will be contacted by email when the video is available to view. If you would like to purchase a copy of either Gretchen or Paterson's books, they will be available from our partner bookseller, Fox Lane Books, at foxlanebooks.co.uk. Thank you from the bottom of my heart again.
Appreciate you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Night, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Thank you.